Great. Diolch yn fawr. Gareth Parry, dwi Head of Policy with Farmers Union of Wales, and thank you again for the opportunity to come and speak and to provide the farmers' voice, one of many farmers' voices here at this summit. I think it is really important, before I begin, to have our voices here. As Rhys has just mentioned, the amount of land in Wales that is managed by farmers in one way or another is high, and obviously we've spoken this morning around nature-based solutions, and many of which we need. Farmer buy-in and farmer trust is absolutely key to that success. But just again as well, just to address any misconceptions around the future of public money in the sense of agricultural support here in Wales. We are in development of the sustainable farming scheme, of course. Many of us in the room here are involved in those discussions. And, be under no illusion that that scheme will be a huge step change moving from the current form of direct payments to the new scheme, which is primarily environmentally based. And it does, in its current, we're still in those discussions, but there will be requirements in there for things like benchmarking, for measuring, for soil health planning. So, it's not like we're standing still by any means, and it is the hope that we'll have the same number of farmers receiving direct support now as going into this new scheme, and that will be a huge step change for the industry, just getting on that journey to more sort of environmental thinking, but alongside their current farming practices. And I think so just to plug that really, that we're not by any means standing still in the future of public support. So just briefly outline the FUW. So our vision really is to have a community of thriving, sustainable family farms in Wales, and sustainability, as we mentioned, that obviously covers three pillars of economic, environmentally, and social across the industry. And I think that's quite an important consideration within this space. It's quite easy to get sucked into conversations sometimes around environmental outcomes and things without necessarily considering the wide implications for Welsh society. We are democratic, so of course we have a membership, but our policies are formulated by consultation with our membership. So I am very much here representing the views of our members, and it's worth highlighting there that Patrick has given some insight into his own farming practices, but we have to account for all farm types, all farm sizes throughout all parts of Wales, and you can imagine the differences that we're having to deal with and represent. Find that middle ground between some farmers potentially in Pembrokeshire compared to them in Rhydymain and Enghraifft. So it is, you can appreciate that it can be quite challenging in that space when we start speaking about these types of solutions. But of course, I'm obviously speaking here on behalf of the policy department representing those views, but naturally we have a team, we have teams throughout Wales then within the county offices who then provide services and support to our members in various forms. And that then does include support with like regulatory requirements, for example, and various other things. So there's very much a two-way service in which we provide to our membership. I have to admit, I presented these slides to one of the first ministers' summits back in July, but I think it's very much pertinent to this. It's a bit broader than food, but it does provide quite an insight into where we are in terms of water regulation and improving water quality. So in terms of our vision then, we've been plugging this for many years by now in terms of carrot, not the stick. And it comes back to Rhys's point there around farmers' mentality. I think it is overlooked in some ways, but it's actually quite crucial to this conversation. There's also a question around whether regulation, so essentially the stick, is actually effective. Sometimes it'll take years to be able to demonstrate through data, through measuring whether that regulatory regime has been effective in itself. And as such, I think we really need to be careful that we don't keep adding regulation because we're unable to identify whether previous regulation has been effective. So there's an important point there not to jump ahead of ourselves, I think, and really understand whether the approach that is currently being adopted with regards to agricultural pollution is actually going to address the issue on the ground. And I am, I am welcomed. We haven't had initial discussions with Dr. Susanna Bolton, who's been appointed to oversee the review of the current regulations, and I welcome the fact that she does acknowledge that the data that we'll have on whether these regulations have been effective, because they've only just really been introduced in their full entirety, will be limited, and it will be difficult to identify whether those regulations have delivered exactly what we've been expecting them to, or whether it will take a number of years to be able to demonstrate that. Farmer-led approach, again, there are some brilliant examples across Wales of where farmers have come together, and again, I think the examples provided by the previous speaker has demonstrated that, where if there's funding available, it doesn't necessarily be through Welsh Government, but there are opportunities where farmers can get on board with ideas and tackle their catchment issues, which will differ between various areas, especially if the correct guidance is available. Investment opportunities, actions cost money, and it was mentioned earlier on around how farmers react to economic pressures, market demands, and various other things. And even the economic impact assessment of the regulations estimated costs of £400 million, and yet the support we've had has been around 50. So there is a huge financial burden on the industry at the moment to comply with those regulations that have just come into force. And I think for anyone who hasn't seen the artwork from yesterday, it's very impressive, to be fair. But I think the face on the farmer's face on there demonstrates it all. Worry, to be honest with you. There are some serious pressures on farmers at the moment through regulatory burden. We've seen announcement from the budget, of course, last week, and then obviously the sort of uncertainty around whether they'll be receiving, or the level of public money that they'll have access to in future. So there are some serious uncertainties out there at the moment, and they are trying their absolute best to respond as best as they possibly can. Innovative alternatives, I've mentioned that there's some good examples, but farmers acknowledge that the work of, for example, Gelliair have done with regards to weather stations is impressive. I think it's a really good technological example of where we can use developing evidence and science to help tackle this issue. It doesn't necessarily have to be rigid, as was discussed by the previous panel. This is a big one for us, robust data collection and water quality monitoring, and I'll come on to a slide in a second around farmers' trust. And I think being able to demonstrate how certain actions on the ground should result in action, rather than just being told you must do this without necessarily understanding why. I think that's a really good point around farmer behaviour. And then just finally, collaborative approach, and I'm sure that was mentioned a fair bit yesterday as well, but our commitment as the FEW to be in these conversations, I hope, demonstrates that we are committed to having a collaborative approach, and we are involved in a number of other stakeholder groups as well. So just briefly, in terms of the actions that we offer as the FEW, of course, we try and raise awareness, and understanding is quite a crucial part of current regulations. We do offer a support package to our membership for completing the records that are now required of them, and I think that in itself, yes, of course, it creates an opportunity for the union from a business case perspective, but in reality, it doesn't. If farmers are having to pay consultants or unions to do that paperwork for them, in my mind, it demonstrates a poorly thought out regulation, because it weakens the value of that exercise to the farmer. It doesn't necessarily mean then that the farmer understands what those figures mean for their business. And does that then necessarily result in change in management practice on the ground? It's questionable. So it comes back to, again, how rigid the current regulatory regime is. I mentioned the third point already around making sure that those policies are formed on robust science, again, that farmers can trust. Collaborative working in catchment areas, we're involved in a few other groups. The Tavy catchment is a good example. So we are trying to build that collaborative working where we can, and but I just want to plug all of that really and say that yes, we represent the views of our membership, but in effect it is a business decision at the end of the day for every single one of those members and every single farmer across Wales. So as much as we can support them, as much as we can work with other stakeholders at a catchment level and raise awareness across our membership, depending on the situation of that business, the economic situation for that business, it is up to them in terms of how they engage with whatever. So I think it comes back to farmer mentality, making sure that we can provide those tools for them to engage and feel like they're in control of what's being provided to them or offered to them. Actions from farmers then, I mentioned the 3 pillars of sustainability: economic, social and environmental. They are absolutely fundamental in our view, and if farmers or farm businesses are economically viable, they will then be able to deliver for society and for the environment, and I think that's absolutely crucial. And we were discussing last night, I think, around how the supply chain, or the beyond the farm gate, isn't necessarily rewarding the real market prices to allow that to happen, and that's in reality that's where our subsidy regimes have developed. Making sure the food is cheap on shelves. And that stems from European principles, of course. But I have to make this point. The primary goal of our members is to produce food, and that's how they've been farming for a number of generations. And we can't get that has to be fundamental to and central to this conversation. And it's been mentioned now, the importance of grazing management for various benefits and co-benefits, and particularly cattle in upland areas. And I would raise concern, at least, that any policy that suggests, either intentionally or unintentionally, that stocking rates or stocking numbers should be reduced should be considered extremely carefully, because in effect what could potentially happen is that your less intensive areas, where there isn't necessarily an issue and some excellent work is already happening, becomes less stock intensive, and the more intensive areas become more intensive. And actually, where there is a problem, then it gets worse. So we have to be careful that I do look forward to seeing the regulatory impact assessment of the nitrogen holding limits that have been imposed on farmers now, to really understand what the effects of those regulations are across Wales. Again, understanding the differences between different areas. I think I've covered the other points there, so I won't repeat myself. This is the final slide, really, just to sum up, really. So farmers' trust is key. It's absolutely fundamental to get farmers on board with this. Whether it's catchment solutions, or whether it's national regulatory regimes. We've got to bring them on board, and they've got to feel in control rather than them being told that they must do X, Y, and Z. Correct support and guidance is fundamental, and we are trying our utmost to make sure the farmers understand what's now required of them. But that does include financial incentives as well, of course. And actions do cost money, and the regulatory impact assessment for infrastructure, for example, demonstrates that. But it doesn't necessarily mean investment. It also means potential impacts on, again, reduced stocking numbers and various other things. Effective communication between Welsh Government and NRW, and I just want to highlight an example, really, where how farmers that have been inspected for the control of agricultural pollution regulations, things have slightly changed recently with regards to the cross-compliance and the severity of the penalties, which we've welcomed to try and help that relationship. But effectively, what we had seen over recent months is NRW inspecting those farms and supporting those farmers to become compliant where they could. But because of the cross-compliance penalty matrix and the rules that NRW must follow to be a regulator, 2 weeks later, Welsh farmers were receiving a penalty letter through the post from Rural Inspectorate Wales. So on one hand, you had NRW trying to support farmers to understand the paperwork, trying to make them compliant, and then 2 weeks later they were receiving a penalty. And that does nothing to build that trust. There's absolutely nothing to build that relationship between government and farmers, which I would argue is at an all-time low at the moment due to various reasons, and it just doesn't help this conversation in any way. And so I'll just finish on the point around the review of the control of agricultural pollution regulations. In our minds, there's a huge opportunity to make these regulations far more flexible for farmers, and I mentioned earlier on having to adapt and allow them to fit different business models. And I think that's a two-prong approach, one of which is how the regulations are worded at the moment, how they're written around the closed periods, for example. The complex record-keeping requirements that I mentioned, are extremely complex, to be honest, I'm sure most of you will agree. But there's also a sort of, now that the regulations have come into force and we're starting to understand some of the problems and the challenges, there's also a sort of an operational side of this review that we would like to see in terms of how to make sure that process is easier, how to make sure farmers actually understand what's being required of them, but also how that then should help them make better management choices. And I would argue is currently too rigid. So I'll leave it there, Diolch yn fawr, and I'm sure we'll have some interesting questions.